Okay, Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullah. Okay, next we look into learning objective 2. Describe the classes of manufacturing costs and the differences between product and period costs. So managers should ask questions such as the following. So what costs are involved in making a product or providing a service? So that means when you look into a product, or if you are a manufacturer or if you are a service provider, then you need to know what are the costs that involve. Okay, and then if we decrease production volume, will cause a decrease. So what if you reduce your production volume? Means the quantity that you produce, you reduce from, let's say, from 10,000, now it becomes 8,000. Will your cost reduces? Will your cost reduce? So you need to consider this one. And then what impact will automation have on the total cost? And then how can we best control cost? So how can you control your cost? Of course, if you are talking about the cost, you want it to be as minimum as possible. If you are talking about the profit or revenue, you want it to be as maximum as possible. Okay, so in terms of the manufacturing cost or expenditure, so manufacturing costs consists of activities and processes that convert raw materials into finished goods. So whatever cost that you incur from converting it from the raw material until it becomes a finished good, then that will be your cost, so your manufacturing cost. So you have direct materials, you have direct labor, you have manufacturing overhead. These are the three main components of your manufacturing cost. Okay, and then let's look at the first one, that is your direct materials. So direct materials are basically the materials and parts used in manufacturing process. Okay, so direct material, raw materials that can be physically and directly associated with the finished product during the manufacturing process. So for example, if let's say you are producing a book, okay, let's say if this is a book, then this book, the direct material will be all the papers. Okay, the papers that you use to produce this book will be, for example, is the raw material. Okay, so that is your raw material. What about your indirect material? So for your indirect materials, so indirect materials not physically part of the finished product, or they are an impractical to trace to the finished product because their physical association with the finished product is too small in terms of cost. So it can be considered part of the manufacturing overhead. So for example, in the production of book, okay, you have the book. Okay, in this book, you also have the papers. The papers are the direct material. Okay, direct material. So here you can see can be physically and directly associated with the finished product. If let's say this is the book, this is the finished product, and at the end of the day, you can still see the papers. So you can still see the papers. So the papers are your direct material. Okay, what about the glue that you want to stick all the papers together? You need the glue. So that glue is considered as your indirect material. You cannot or impractical for you to trace to the finished product. Okay, they are too small in terms of the cost. Okay, the glue that you use to stick all the papers together. Okay, so that is indirect material. So for material, you need to know you have the direct material, you have the indirect material. So direct material, direct cost is the cost that you can directly trace to your final product. Okay, whereas your indirect cost is the cost that you cannot directly trace to your final product. Okay, so with regard to material, your direct material will be the direct material or the basic raw material that you can directly trace to your final product, whereas your indirect material will be the uh, materials that you cannot directly trace to your final product. So that will be part of your manufacturing overhead. Okay. What about your labor? The second component of your manufacturing cost is your labor. So you have your labor. The first one is your material. The second component is your labor. So what about your labor? So direct labor, work of factory employees that can be physically and directly associated with converting raw materials into finished goods. So those are the labor that work directly in the production process. So that is your direct labor. So indirect labor, work of factory employees that has no physical association with the finished product or for which it is impractical to trace cost to the goods produced. So that is your direct your labor. So the first one is your direct material. So your material, you have direct and indirect. The second one, you have direct labor, you have indirect labor. Okay, so for your direct labor, work for your direct labor means the labor that you can directly trace to the final product, whereas your indirect labor will be the labor that you cannot you cannot trace directly to your final product. So for example, in the production of your book here, so in the production of book, you will have the the production line workers. So that production line workers are the workers that involve directly in producing this particular book. Okay, so the wages that you pay or the salaries that you pay to all that workers will be known as your direct labor. Whereas in a factory, you also have the security guard. So that security guard, for example, does not work directly to produce this particular book. So but you have to pay wages and salaries for them. So that it will be the indirect labor. For example, you have the cleaner. So the wages that you pay to the cleaner will be indirect labor. Okay, so you need to differentiate between direct labor and indirect labor. Okay, the third component that we have is the manufacturing cost or manufacturing overhead. So what is manufacturing overhead? These are the costs that are indirectly associated with manufacturing the finished product. So that includes all manufacturing costs except direct materials and direct labor. So if you cannot classify that cost as your direct material, you cannot classify that cost as your direct labor, then everything will be dump it as your manufacturing overhead. So it is also called the factory overhead or indirect manufacturing cost or burden. So you remember the three components that you have. So the three components that you have will be the direct material, so the direct labor. So if that is your indirect material, so indirect material will fall under the category of manufacturing overhead. What about the indirect labor? Indirect labor is also part of your manufacturing overhead. So the three main components you're going to have for a manufacturing cost will be your direct material, direct labor, and manufacturing overhead. So hopefully that is clear. So thank you very much.